Welcome back. Now that we've discussed our first playwright, Aristophanes, we're now going to talk more generally about the particular dramatic form called Old Comedy. In our previous video, we talked about the general production of Greek drama, both tragedy and comedy, stage drama, especially in 5th century BC Athens. One reason we obviously focus a great deal on 5th century Athens specifically is that most of our evidence comes from that city-state during this period, the 400s BC. But in addition to that, Athens was unique in the ancient Greek world and practically in all of literature historically, with the possible exception of Gilbert and Sullivan in England. In having this form of drama called Old Comedy, that in particular focused a lot of attention, as we have here, on pillorying the politics of the day, specifically as part of the plot in the play that was put on stage. Most plays, as you probably well can imagine, are removed from reality and present a world to the audience that, although maybe relevant to the real world, is still separate from what goes on in the real world. But Athens crosses that border metatheatrically to make direct commentary and often criticism of what was going on in actual real-life time in ancient Athens. So this is really a marvelous opportunity for us to get a specific historic insight into what was going on in ancient Athens from the standpoint of a playwright who was making indirect political commentary to his audience, partly obviously in order to get prizes, as we talked about in the previous video on stage drama, but also because he probably does have a genuine concern about his city-state, and he could see things potentially going wrong, and in some cases, in fact, actually going wrong. And so, therefore, he makes these particular comments. So it's important to understand that Athenian democracy really was the only environment in the ancient Greece in which this type of drama could be produced. The type of drama that would allow an audience to sit there and essentially take in all of this lampooning and satire and such, all against ancient Athens, the ancient Athenian demos, the people, was really pretty much unparalleled in any other times. Certainly later Athens, under the Macedonian regime, and the Romans after that, definitely did not have this kind of sense of humor and would not have tolerated the kind of direct attacks being made on contemporary politicians the way that it happened with Athens. So with that in mind, we're going to talk a bit about what distinguishes Old Comedy in particular. Obviously, Old Comedy, although it does share some of the elements of stage drama with tragedy, again, that we talked about in the previous video, does break off on its own in some quite unusual ways. Some of them, hopefully, many of them quite fun for you to follow. But Old Comedy has a very specific purpose that really, as I said before, is not really paralleled with other forms of drama. So it's important to understand how the production and the rest of the process of making Old Comedy parallels exactly what goes on, again, in the ancient world, but also with drama in particular. So, okay, let's talk now about the actual production of Old Comedy itself. First of all, as we talked about in the tragedy comedy stage drama video, stage drama in ancient Athens was produced at several major festivals during the calendar year. Although City Dionysia, right here, was the best known one because that was the one worshiping the Greek god Dionysus. In fact, there were several other major festivals during the year at which drama could be produced. The one that actually is most distinct for comedy in particular is the one called the Lenaia Festival, Lenaia. AEA, excuse me. This one was a rather unusual one in itself because this was a localized festival produced around January on our calendar that had only Athens, the Athenians, within the city of Athens within the audience. So that means that the plays being produced, the comedies, would in fact have been directed at a specifically Athenian audience, whereas the much larger City Dionysia Festival produced on our calendar in March would have been for a much broader audience that would have included visitors from other city-states to come watch. So that means that Lanaya plays could potentially have a specific focus at the what was known to be a practically all Athenian audience, whereas City Dionysia might have tried for somewhat larger comic concepts that visitors from other city-states could appreciate, even if they were not up close and personal with the Athenian politics. So these are the places where we have these plays produced. Now, unlike the tetralogy that tragic playwrights were forced to produce for their contribution to the tragic festivals, the comic playwrights were required to produce only one play. Just as with the tragic dramas, there would be a panel of judges, and out of the comic plays produced, there would have been a first, a second, and a third place awarded. And as we talked about in that previous video, first place was absolutely fantastic, and second place was considered to be a real failure. And of course, we don't talk about third place, although you will hear more about third place in the case of Aristophanes with clouds. Of course, we referred to it in our video on Aristophanes before. So when you get to clouds, you'll hear more about that. In any event, so this was, again, as with drama in general, a very competitive environment, and it was really incumbent upon the author to try everything he could to be able to win, because coming away after all that effort with a less than satisfactory result of second place or below was just simply not what anybody was there for. The point was to get that first place prestige as much as possible. Now, Athenian Old Comedy drama, as with tragedy, was masked. So all the actors on stage, just like with tragedy, would have been wearing masks and would have had costumes that, just like with stage drama, with tragedy, would have allowed them to change costume in the middle in order to go from one particular role to another. One thing that is different is that we talked about the three actors with stage tragedy. There's a slight difference with Old Comedy. Here, there actually is allowed to be a fourth actor. That fourth actor does not do very much on stage other than do very small bit parts, usually in collusion with the main third actor. But it does mean that comedy is a little bit more expensive than tragedy in having that fourth actor appear, even if only for very brief times. That said, though, the use of the fourth actor was, even with Aristophanes, was relatively scarce, and it really was much more common to rely on just the same three actors as we saw before. So again, mask and costume change would have been necessary in order for an actor to go from one character to another, and choral interludes in between would have been needed in order to allow an actor to get off stage and be able to change costume when necessary. Now, costumes, however, has a rather interesting take on it that is certainly not what you would get in tragedy, and that is the nature of the costume. Frequently, the male characters would have worn these very heavily padded costumes that essentially would have made them look very buffoon-like. Also, there could be specific trappings of each costume that would be appropriate for the particular characters. So, for instance, with Dionysus in Frogs, the play you're reading later, we suspect that while Dionysus is sporting the lion skin and club of Hercules, that he's, as part of his disguise to go down into the underworld, that in fact he probably is wearing all of that on top of some kind of yellow saffron that makes him look effeminate. So when you read that play and you come across the scene where Heracles bursts out laughing because he sees the lion skin and club on top of something that's very effeminate, probably what we have is a combination of that yellow saffron and the lion skin all together, making the character of Dionysus look twice as ridiculous as he probably already did. So there would be details like that, but in general, the padded costume, especially for the male characters, would have been the norm. Female characters probably wore something similar, but with somewhat less padding, and if necessary, any anatomical features of the female character needed could be indicated on the costume itself. Now, that brings us to the subject of the male costume. As you will quickly see in Aristophanes' plays, there are a lot of references to the male member. And that brings us to the definitely most unusual and probably memorable aspect of the ancient Greek male costume in comedy, and that is the leather phallus that was attached to the front. Now, the phallus gets around, and I mean around. In the case of Lysistrata, you will see how very hard the phallus can get with the male characters. In the case of Wasps, we have this elderly man who extends his phallus to this lady in order to help her to climb up on stage. And it's actually in the course of her doing that we realized that there had to actually be a raised stage. We referred to that in our video on stage tragedy. So there's that. In Peace, not a play that we're actually reading, but Aristophanes' Peace, there's this huge dung beetle that the main character, Tragaius, is going to ride in order to rescue the kidnapped peace goddess, Irene. And in order to get there, he's got to get this dung beetle to fly. And so, of course, the way to steer him is very appropriately with a nice rudder that he has right in front of him. So it gets around. And as you can imagine, there are many, many other phallic and other body part jokes that come up along the way. So the costuming with the leather phallus is one particular way to make the humor as lubricious as possible. Also, of course, a lot of the humor is sexual in nature. And again, I'm sure there were things on the costumes that would have indicated the appropriate parts of the body needed for all that. So that's costuming. The other, of course, rather weird feature of Old Comedy are the choruses. Sometimes they are animals, sometimes they are people, and sometimes they are other elements like clouds, as you'll see in your first video. So the clouds are essentially surrogate goddesses, you will see in the first play, because the philosopher Socrates, the one whose wrong argument is going to teach the young man how to get out of debt, has in fact chosen no longer to worship the traditional gods of Greece, like Zeus, for instance, and instead worships meteorological phenomena like the clouds and the ones that they produce, such as lightning and such. So the clouds end up being essentially a new form of deity in that particular chorus. The wasps are just what they sound like, and they're actually old jurors with stings, maybe the phallus, I suppose. They use the stings in order to get at all the defendants. They need to probe them as quickly as possible. And then we have, of course, birds, which again is just what it sounds like, somewhere between 12 and 24 birds of different species. And then the frogs one is actually interesting. The frogs are actually one of two different choruses that appear in that particular play, and the frogs are not even the main chorus. They actually appear only for a single scene as Dionysus goes down into the underworld. The main chorus turns out to be one of initiates into the mystery cult of Demeter and Persephone, oddly. So Aristophanes does something really quite weird there in not having the named chorus be the main one. Still, though, the frogs are quite memorable with quacks, quacks. That's what they sound like in order to imitate frogs. You'll see that when you get to that particular play. So the animal choruses definitely make a big difference. Even in the case of plays where the chorus is not actually animals, such as Lysistrata, there are different ways that the chorus can interact with the main characters. In the case of the Lysistrata, the two men semi-choruses, the male one and the female one, are in dispute practically most of the way through the play until they end up being reconciled about 3/4 of the way in. So their particular role, the elderly men and the elderly women of the city, represent old-time views that the Athenians might need to recall as they struggle with not only the war, but also the overthrow of their democratic government that happened the same year when that particular play was produced. So the women in that play take over the Athenian government and force the men to make peace and end the war. The wives doing that particularly to the husbands. So those two choruses go back and forth, reflecting the dispute of the sexes, so to speak, going on in that particular play as part of that plot. So that's a lot of what was on with Old Comedy. Old Comedy probably was an extra development from the original dithyrambic Dionysiac chorus discussed in that previous video, referred to us by Aristotle's Poetics. It may have been perhaps taken specifically from the celebration of Dionysus by the satyrs, and probably in addition to the actual satyr play that was associated with tragedy, it may have been just an extra production in honor of Dionysus produced by that playwright. Okay, so that's the production. Now, the plot of Old Comedy is also quite unusual. Again, very different from tragedy. Tragedy, with one notable exception, is based practically exclusively on the plots of Greek myth. The one exception is Aeschylus's Persians, the first surviving play we have, referred to us in Aristophanes' Frogs, that is based, even though somewhat mythically, on the historic event in 480 BC of the Athenian defeat of the Persian invaders into Greece at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. But all the other tragedies we have surviving, and all the other ones that we know of by name that do not survive to us, are based on some type of myth. That is definitely not the case with Old Comedy. It's actually not the case with any of the comedies, although myth can sometimes play an indirect role in some of the plots in isolated spots. But with Old Comedy, what we have is a totally way out story that's being told that really is disconnected from reality. So essentially, it's a big fantasy. So it's a fantastical plot and not a mythological plot. That's the thing that to be noted. And so this fantastic plot essentially presents the audience with more like a very odd and rather distinctive idea that's meant to be somewhat educational as well as amusing, a form of entertainment for the audience. So with Clouds, we have the attempt to get out of debt. That's carried on by the philosopher Socrates. In the case of Wasps, we have the whole business of the actual wasps, who are the jurymen who gone awry with their stings. In the case of Birds, we have the whole concept of the city up in the clouds that's going to end up, in fact, defeating the Olympian gods for sacrifice. With Frogs, we have the idea of going down into the underworld to fetch the deceased poet Euripides and actually returning instead with the deceased poet Aeschylus. Dionysus, of course, is doing that, and that's very definitely a fantastic plot. And although there is a mythical element to that because Dionysus is the main character, this particular story does not parallel any other stories we have in Greek myth. It's one that clearly is Aristophanes' own creation. So the plots, therefore, are removed from fantasy. So that might make you think, okay, so this is obviously escapism, right? It's meant to be a form of just pleasure and entertainment, recreation, just meant to help the audience to have a little relaxing time, maybe get away from politics for a little bit. No. Hope I didn't fool you there. That's actually not the case, curiously. The plots of Old Comedy do, in fact, remove the audience in a certain way from reality. That is true. However, the paradox of Old Comedy is that the plots are also all too reality-based for the audience. And in fact, the ingenuity of Old Comedy, and specifically Aristophanes, is that there is going to be that byplay between the real world and the fictitious world created, and non-mythological world created within the boundaries of the play. So probably the most ingenious example of that is Birds. You have the birds and the humans who together team up to construct this new polis, city-state, up in the clouds. So it's separate from Athens. Originally, the intent was to get away from Athens and be able to live a nice, wonderful, cheery world, all, like sort of like Candyland, away from the real world and and a place where there are no problems and there's no litigation and no politics and no war and all that great stuff. Well, by the time you get all finished, as you'll see when you read Birds, the polis has been turned all upside down, and it becomes essentially the same as Athens all over again, except now up in the sky. And instead of going after other polis, it goes after the gods and ends up becoming a supreme tyranny, essentially. With the guy who was trying to get away from Greek politics ends up being at the head of it, and then ends up becoming supreme tyrant, even marrying the divine princess as part of the bargain. So the whole concept of the city up in the clouds gets essentially reflected back into the Greek world by its essentially resembling Athens. That's of course the twist. And so in that sense, the Athenians can recognize aspects of their own life in this new city, and it's pretty blunt. When you read it, you'll see exactly what's going on with that. So that means that Old Comedy does in fact directly target Athenian society, Athenian civilization, and of course specific Athenian individuals. You'll be hearing, especially in WASPs, quite a bit about our good fellow Cleon, the one who's called Ruff because his name is so much like a dog. But there are many other names who are mentioned. Cleonymus, the one who drops his shield when he runs away from battle, something quite disgraceful. Of course, we have Socrates, and we have Dionysus himself, and a lot goes on with the playwright Euripides. But along the way, there'll be quite a bit of discussion of either individuals in Athens, the individual leaders, or the decisions that the Athenian populace is making on behalf of the city, and especially within the war itself. And again, it must be emphasized that Old Comedy, as we have it, happens to go right along with the period of Athenian history, the war between Athens and Sparta, known to us as the Peloponnesian War, which will be the very detailed subject of future videos in this course. So therefore, understanding that this is a special characteristic of Old Comedy, not seen really in many other places, is what you need to appreciate in order to understand what's going on with the Old Comedy. And again, we will spend a good part of this course on Aristophanes, but then when we switch over to the other three tragic playwrights nearer to the end of the course, you will be able to see the marked difference between Aristophanes' concept of comedy and that was rather necessarily chosen and used by later playwrights. Okay, well that concludes our quick survey of Old Comedy, and we will now start getting into the videos on the plays in particular that you're reading, as well as the background historical information that you need on Athens and the war in particular with Sparta. Okay, we'll see you next video.